Okay, so I don't know what happened with the other laptop. I'm back kind of with this laptop. So I generated the second activity, and the code is kind of almost the same. It has a button, and it has kind of yeah, the activity I generated was with the template with the action button. So the fabulous action button has a callback, and it basically sets the some sort of a behavior on that button. What is interesting is that the second activity, like, so the first generated activity basically has a constrained layout and a text view, right? I've added the button, but it basically has a kind of just the constrained layout and the text view and the button in it. Whereas the second activity that I generated, and it probably is the same in your case, is a little bit more complex. So it has the coordinator layout with the up bar at the top, the toolbar, and then it has the floating action button on the bottom, and the content of the middle is actually in a separate XML file. And I'm including the middle, the actual content of the layout, from a second file which is called content second, right? This design is because I have the floating action button, right? The first activity was a basic activity without any action buttons or anything. You need to put things yourself, whereas the second one has this kind of a split. And then the content is empty, right? So the actual content, apart from the action button, that doesn't exist, right? So if you want to kind of add something here, like we need to add those two buttons. So I would say work. Yeah, things are not as collaborating today as they should. Yeah. Okay, maybe it will work. No? Did you successfully edit the buttons? Yeah, it's perfect. So I don't know what's happening today, but let me just add the button in text. What's the difference adding text like by XML or by drag and drop? Does it make a difference? What do you think? Yeah, that's right. So we need closing. So the drag and drop will generate the equivalent XML, and then some people prefer to work with mouse, and some people prefer to work with keyboard. The UI kind of helps you. So, for example, for the layout width and layout height, it should let me check. Yeah, it kind of gives me hint. So I have kind of a choices here. So each component lives with it's a hierarchy, right? The whole thing lives in the content view, and then you have usually the layout manager, and then the layout manager lays out the space into the children, and then the children manage their space, right? So my button will live directly in the constrained layout, and then I can make the width and the height of that button kind of matching the outer layer of where it is placed, right? So if I did that, it means my button will occupy the entire space of the parent. if I say ROP, it will try to be as small as possible, but still display itself, right? So the match parent kind of grows it to the parent size. ROP content kind of, if I have text, it will kind of make it as big as the text. Because I don't have any text, it will be pretty much invisible right now, right? So if I have if I go to a design view, I pretty much should not see this button. And there are some constraints problem because I don't have any text, therefore there is nothing to display, right? In XML you have two notations, so you open a tag, it's like HTML. You open a tag with the less than and then more than signs and the kind of the key item and the properties of it, and then you close the tag like this. You always need to close the tag. If you don't close the tag, it will be an error. And then if you, because usually the XML constraint file doesn't have any content inside the thing. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Then you can kind of have everything wrapped like this, right? And then I can say I need Android text for the actual text of my button, and I can pick, that's what I wanted to show you before. I have kind of the let's say I'm picking the cancel word, right? So I have a string and I defined the cancel, and then I can change it for Norwegian. So instead of hard coding cancel, the word cancel, I have the ampersand and string, which points to my resource values strings. And then if you check here, I have yeah, let's just have one. I have a cancel and it says word cancel. So in my content I can say cancel, and then it will use that string from there, right? Yeah, exactly. So it kind of wiggles here because it says, well, the button doesn't have any constraints and I'm in a constrained layout, so I should actually place the button somewhere, right? If we go to the design view and I could see the button, I could kind of drag it and work with some of the layout constraints of where it is. I have some issues with the IDE, but you can do that, right? So you can place those two buttons kind of in the bottom part of the screen and lay them side by side. So you can lay it out properly. That like playing with the UI, I don't care for this lecture. What I care is that now I have two classes. I have one class called main activity, and I have the second class called second activity. So in this class, I will have to have a button. So let's let me add this one here. So yeah, that's fine. Let's see if I can see it. Yes, the button is visible. Exactly. So you kind of work with the constraints by like placing them relative to some other elements, or by specifying the kind of absolute values. So for example, I said that the absolute values for where the button should be placed in the editor are specified by pixels, but for the actual font deployment, they will be specified by ROP content. So the button will be as big as the text that it needs to display, right? So if I have the word cancel, it will have certain size, but if I translate it to Norwegian and it's different width, the button will scale accordingly, right? This usually can potentially mess things up, because if you look at how it looks here, it will show particular view, but it doesn't mean on the phone it will be exactly the same view, right? So you always need to kind of deploy it into the emulator or onto the phone to really see how the layout is laid out. This does a good job. They are improving it. Originally it wasn't as good, but now it's better and kind of works quite well. So how so I have a cancel button, and yeah, let me see, it's called button, right? So with the ampersand and ID, you can see that I have a plus here, right? And I don't have IDs in my resource folder anywhere, right? It is a little bit, so for some IDs, I need to refer them in the code, and I need to have some names. So if I say plus, it means this ID doesn't exist yet. It's kind of generated in this spot. If I don't have a plus, if I just have this, it will say, okay, I will use one of the existing IDs. For example, if I want to lay myself next to an item, another component, I will use an ID of that component, so then I use it without the plus, right? So with the plus, I'm creating a new button, and then in the code, I need to register on click listener, and then we need to do main activity. Yes, I need to wire up the content of this. Yeah, that's fine. That looks fine. So what I'm missing? Yeah, anyway, so when you do the button on set click listener, do you have it red as well, or it works? Yeah, maybe, but yeah, I don't see it. I'm kind of missing something trivial. I can. It should. Yeah, I need to do it when the wiggle happens. Now. Nope. Anyway, yeah, so once you have it sorted, then what we want to start a new activity. And to start a new activity, we need an intent, right? So we need an instance of the intent that represents the other activity that we have. So let me see if this works. Some things are not. Yeah. So I need an intent for the second activity, and once yeah, so what are intents? Intent is like a representation of another class that we can instantiate, and it has a certain action associated with it. So if I go, let me open a browser. Yeah, where is it? So so there is a website, and there are more registries where you can browse the specification of how the intents are organized. So let me just give you an example. So if I have a camera app, right? I have some sort of view with the take photo button and a preview, right? And then that's one activity that the camera app has. Another activity that the camera app has is probably like I have a photo here and I have some sort of filters. I can do some manipulations on that picture. And I may have another activity that the camera app has, right? So all those three activities are part of the camera app. And then I have a specific activity, which is actually for taking the photo, right? And then you may have an app, and then let's say you have a running app, and then you have an icon saying it kind of tracks your location, so you have some sort of map. And then you can, like when you are in a particular spot, you have like a take photo button, and you can take a photo at that spot, right? So this is your app, and you have a particular activity. You can have multiple activities here as well. And then in this activity, you want to launch an activity which takes a photo. So what you can do is, instead of writing your own activity and launching it here, you can link this button with this activity from a different app and launch somebody else's activity to conduct certain action. So it will be on top of your phone. And then when it's done, you go back to your view, right? You often see that for the camera apps. You often see that for a web view, for browsing a content. And this linking between an Android world where your app lives and somebody else's app, which you have kind of no control over, is done through the intent. So this intent is like a message which has a certain action, and it has a certain content which links. So the action is like typical metadata associated with a particular activity. So in this case, for example, it could be photo capture, right? So we can kind of browse the registry and check what are the system intents. Yeah, let me make it intent registry, and then we have a number of standard like for example picking a file or take a picture, right? So for example here we have, yeah, it's too small, take a picture. So take a picture is an activity which is called android.media.action and capitalized image capture. And if so, it's image capture. And if this image capture, like if you wrote your own app and you have your own activity for capturing a photo, you can say, okay, my activity can react to this image capture request and launch itself, and then somebody else can use your app to take to capture an image, right? And this is done in kind of completely ad hoc fashion. It's a little bit like in Golang interfaces. Like if someone puts an app and marks that this is an image capture activity, then whoever wants to take a photo can use your app to do that, right? So there are two things. So there is this kind of the action field, and it's like dynamically linking what the activity can do with who needs that activity. And then there is a concrete link. So this is like a symbolic link, like dynamic linking between activities, and this one is like a hardwired. So if you know the package name, of this Google app or this proprietary app, you can say, I want image capture, but from this particular app, right? So then this particular activity will be called. So you have a choice of being open, and then the user usually have a list. So sometimes you see that, like there is a PDF, and you click on the PDF, and it says, okay, which app do you want to open the PDF, right? Because multiple apps register that they can deal with PDF documents. It's the same for all the other functionalities. And then when you're designing your app and you're designing your activities, you can kind of mark them as capable of doing certain things. And then when the user needs a certain action, they will be listed as possible options. So that's the action one. The concrete one, you basically use the concrete type of the activity that you have, and what it means is it's the full package name, right? So it will be like the full package. Package name dot this type, the actual activity activity type. So it's like the full string, which is not really a string. It's like the identifier to link directly to this binary, which is your activity, and then you can kind of launch it. And then we have two calls. So we have one call which is start activity. And the best way, so there is a Android developers portal which has all the API descriptions, and it's kind of a good to use it, because then you see like the either Java or Kotlin syntax for it. So let me pick Kotlin, and then not activity, yes. So on the activity, it's one of the methods which is so here you have those lifecycle methods which we were discussing earlier, and one of the yeah, let's just search. Yeah, it's the same. I need, yeah. So it's defined in the context, and activity inherits from context type, and start activity basically takes an intent, and the intent class can be instantiated either by just having the action field or having the concrete type. So if we navigate to the intent, we will have the view of what constructors we can use for creating the instance. So yeah, come on, it's quite fat. So it has a lot of constants. This Android intent action image capture constant will be here. So you either use it as a constant or as a string, right? So we try to avoid magic strings or magic numbers. So usually you will say context. You would say intent dot action media image capture as a constant. Yeah, let me just scroll to the constructors. So right, so you have of course you can create an intent from a previously defined intent, but then the other alternative is you can use this intent string thing, right? So if we use this constructor, then you would say intent dot, and then you would use this constants, which I don't want to scroll again, but there is what was the first word? Yeah, action, media, and so on, right? So you'll use this kind of, you will say, in Java you'll say new, but here you'll say intent, and then you have the constant, which defines this string. So this method expects string, but this constant is a string. Then the second option is you have the string and the URI. And this URI points to somebody else's application with that action string, and then you can launch, for example, Google photo taking app or a PDF browser or something like this. And then we have the final one, which is this one, which takes the first parameter is the context, and activity itself is a context. So usually you would say this, comma, so intent this, comma, and then the second one is the class, right? So there is a kind of a literal which takes the package name plus the type dot class, which represents the class of that type. Yeah. You cannot find where I am. So if you go to so it's called developer.android.com, and if you go there, there is a docs sub like /docs. So if I do that /docs, you basically go there and then you go to reference, and in the API reference, where do we go? Android platform, I think. Yes. So then from the reference you go to Android platform, and then you have all the classes which are here. But the easiest way is just to search for it. But you can navigate. So in the main Android, you should see classes, and then you should, yeah, we have this generated R. And then in the app, we should have activity. So android.app activity is there, and intent will be here as well. Let me check. Intent service is here, but intent is in the different package. But in the activity, you will have some references, so you can navigate. I mean, the easiest is just to search. So if you go intent again, it's android.content. So activity is android.app, and intent is android.content in that package. So android.content intent. So the hierarchy usually starts with Android for all the platform-specific classes, and then you have some sub-packages. Did you find it? Yeah. Perfect. That is kind of there is a literal which you use to depict an instance. So what other literals do you know? What are literals in programming language? Yeah? Like what? So if I say final string, that's Java. My constants equals my constants, right? In Kotlin, I would say const C equals MC. So where do I have a literal here? Yeah, that part, right? That is a literal. So what are the literals we use often? So a string is a nice one. I'm not talking about Kotlin here. In general, in all programming languages, we have strings, we have numbers, right? Like the decimals. Decimal numbers, like for example 10 or 10.23, right? So numbers, decimals, and kind of floats. Yeah, so how would you represent an object literal in C++, for example, or another language that you know? You have to construct the class, but can you have it in place, right? So literal is something that if you say equals, that thing is here at compile time, right? So a literal means it's a kind of an object or reference or value or something that exists already at compile time and it's here, right? It's not the reference to something, it is actually the thing right here, right? So for example, for objects, we usually don't have literals because you have to create an instance and then you can use it, right? But for numbers, we can use it directly, right? So useful literals are strings, this. A useful literal is a multi-line string, right? Some programming languages like Kotlin allows you to have a multi-line strings, right? In C++ you can't have it. And here you kind of can. In C++ you kind of can have it with the kind of a slash at the end of the line, right? You have a single quote string, but it can span multiple lines, right? Floats, like if I add an F here, that means it will be a float literal, right? That by default with Kotlin, this literal is double, but I can have a float literal. I can have hexadecimal literals, right? And so on. So one of those literals in Java and in Kotlin is the literal for the class. And that's kind of unique because it actually points directly to the content of that class, right? So it's a reference. As you see here in this method, I need a reference. Where is it? So much scrolling. So if you go to this constructor again, this class has loads of constants, yes. So here, normally, I would need to have a reference to an object which is of type, what type is that object? No, here. So in this line, if I call intent, and I need to pass two parameters, what's the first parameter? The context. So a reference to an instance of the context. And because I am inside an activity is an instance of the context because it inherits from context, I can say this. So what's the second parameter? That's right, but it's a reference to an object which is of type class, right? Yeah. So so normally if I have, let's say I have a constructor which, let's say I have M and it takes a string as a parameter, right? What can I do? I can call M with a literal, or I can call M with a reference, and S is a string, right? Something, right? So I can do one of those two things, right? What if I say, okay, M takes a person? Can I do a literal of a person? No, I can't create an instance of a person right here on the spot. What I could do is I could say new in Java, and then person, so with, and and then kind of instantiate an instance and pass it directly, right? But it's kind of I have to have, this has to happen in runtime. It doesn't happen at compile time, right? Whereas if I do this, if I put the literal in here, the value of this literal is like right here at the compile time. So with this method, I have this kind of a shortcut where I can say person dot class, and that represents a literal, which is an instance of the object which represents the class person, right? It's a little bit complex. It's like a meta thing because it's an instance, but it represents the type, right? All right. And then I have kind of a more complex constructors, but usually we either go with this one or with this one, right? We like, if we don't care, we let the user choose. So we say we need to open a PDF, and then we say, okay, we need something which can open a PDF, and then the user is given options. If the user doesn't have any app which opens PDF, then we can't really open it. Or we have written a particular activity that we control, and that's what we want to launch, right? So I will kind of fiddle with my problems, but what I would like you to do is to answer like 2 questions. So imagine this scenario again. So we have the main activity, we have the second, and we have the third. And here we have console, and the console basically calls finish, right? So finish closes the current activity and takes it off the screen, right? So console does this, and we have the back button. And here we call to. Here we say, in the button we say start activity, and we pass the literal, so we pass this, comma, second activity dot class, right? So we start the activity which launches this one. This one has console and 3, and then 3 has 1 and 2, and the back button, right? So now this one has a back button. So I want you to tell me, if I press cancel and I call finish, what will happen? Yeah. That will disappear. I will go to home screen, right? So this is my home screen. And the home screen has an icon called my app. And this my app launches this one, right? So if I press cancel, it goes here, and my app is in what state? Finished, yes. It's not an on destroyed. You don't control on destroyed. The operating system will call on destroyed. So it might have not called it yet, right? But it's finished because I finished this activity, so the on stop will be called. So I will go all the way to the on stop, right? What will happen if I'm here and press the back button? I will go back here, and my app will be in on pause state, right? It will not be finished yet. So the difference between calling finish and calling back button is that back button doesn't call finish on its own, right? It will be on pause. So I will have my life cycle going on pause being called, and I can be hanging. Operating system may call on stop later, but it may not, right? If I double click here, I will be called on resume and nothing else, right? Perfect. So then we have this situation. I went here, I press 2, I called this activity, and I'm now here. So cancel again calls finish, and 3 makes start activity, and then it passes the third activity.class, right? So this one launches this one. What will happen when I'm here and press cancel? It will comes back here, right? And this one will be closed, right? So I will have on stop here, correct? Okay. What if I press back button? But this one is paused. Exactly. So if I press this button again, Will I call on create again? No. On resume. Perfect. So now I went from here to here, from here to here. What will happen when I press back button? I will go back here. What will happen if I press and both of those, let's say option 1, here we say start activity. Okay, and we pass main activity dot class as a parameter, right? So I'm pressing here. What will happen? Exactly. I'm kind of back here, but with a second copy of it, right? Because I started a new activity which is the same as this one, but it's actually a copy. It's not the same activity, right? So then if I'm here and I press the back button, what will happen? I will be back here. And I press back button here, I'll be back here, press button here, I'll be back to main activity again, right? It's super confusing to the user, right? If you are here and press back button, what would you expect? You would expect to go to the home screen, right? So this is a bad idea, right? So if you are in the third activity and you need to go back here, it's a bad idea to call start activity because it kind of messes up the flow, right? Similarly, if you are in the third activity and you call start activity here to start this one, you will launch a second copy of it and then it kind of gets messy, right? So usually what we do is we have two options. One option is, this one is easy, you just call finish, right? Right? Because if I'm here and I press finish here, I will go back here and there is no kind of messing up. This one is a little bit problematic, right? Because I would kind of need to go back here, but also tell this app to finish, so it kind of goes here to kind of have this logic logically organized, right? So I would need to like have a mechanism here to detect that when I call on resume, in some cases I will call on finish automatically to go back here, right? Which you can do that this way, but it's a little bit not ideal, right? So if you have situation like this, it will work with activities and it's fine. But if you have a situation like this where the third activity kind of jumps sometimes here, what you should do instead, you shouldn't have a third activity really. What you should have is, you should have second activity, which the button 3 has a different fragment, right? So what was on the third activity will be part of your fragment, like part of this. So the fragment is here. The original second activity content will be your original, so second fragment and third fragment. And this one will manage the buttons and will manage the fragment by the fragment manager. So when you have the second fragment saying cancel, it kind of closes this activity, goes back here. If the second fragment has 3, it shows up this one, and this one has 1 and 2. And now this button is basically a finish, because if I'm in the third view, in the second activity and press 1 that I want to get back here, I don't go here, I kind of finish this activity and come here. And then to launch the previous one, so if I went main activity, second, third view, and press 2, I basically need to swap this, so the activity is the same, it runs continuously, but it can display either the second fragment or the third fragment. Does it make sense? And use a fragment manager to kind of to deactivate those things. By default, the back button on the fragments also remembers which fragment was there before, right? So if I go main activity, second activity but with the second fragment, and I call back button, I will come back here. If I call this first and go here and press back button, it will kind of automatically go back to the previous fragment, and then if I press the back button, it will go out, right? So the fragment manager handling of back button is kind of logical. Of course, you can overwrite it, right? At any point, you can change what the activity does with the back button. So for example, if you in the second activity, and you don't want the back button to behave by default like this, but you want the back button to go to a home screen, right? You can do that. So you basically program what is the action on top of the pressing of the back button, and you program it that it basically shuts down the app or puts the app in a pause state, and you kind of go here, right? Right. So any questions about this? Yep.
If you open the second fragment,
yep.
When you open the third fragment,
yep.
When you go back to the second fragment,
yep.
Will the back button send you back to the main activity or go to the third fragment? So that remember how many times you opened the fragment.
Yeah, so the last time I tested it, it didn't iterate it, like, because you can swap back and forth between two fragments, right? Multiple times. And then the back button only remembers the previous one time. So it doesn't iterate over all those iterations. It kind of goes out of the activity as soon as you are in the first fragment that it had, right? But I don't know. Like, you would need to check it. What is the default behavior of the fragment manager handling of the back button? And it could be device specific. So like on Samsung and on other phones, the default behavior might be different, right? So if you really want to know what will happen, you have to program it. If you're kind of relying on the default, it will be whatever the default is, and I don't know. It might differ from vendor to vendor. Yeah. The important thing is that if you in the activity and you press the back button and the activity kind of goes to the previous activity, there is no finish called, right? So you're in the resume state. In the pause state. So when you go back there, on resume is called, nothing else, right? Yeah, that always is the same across all the vendors. So the logic of the life cycle and the back button relating to the life cycle is kind of unified. But with the fragments, yeah, that is a little bit, I don't know, unclear. It is useful, like you can rewrite the whole app just having one activity and 3 fragments, right? Because this is effectively one fragment, and then I have a second fragment and a third fragment. And I can kind of navigate between them at will, right? So sometimes it's up to you to design your app whether you really need a new activity or whether you just need a new fragment, right? And the way we do it is based on the logic of what the activity does. So we try to group logically, it's like modules in other programming languages. We try to group logically the functionality of what is behind it, and then UI can be multiple, but for the same function. And then if the function is different, if you're actually dealing with something else which makes sense to be a different activity, then you isolate it, right? You can bloat it. You can make one activity really complex to deal with everything in your app, and then have a number of fragments dealing with the different UIs and so on. But then you will see that it's harder to maintain and harder to scale. So it's kind of up to you how you organize it, right? For the sake of the first assignment, we will kind of make it a little bit artificial, that you have number of activities and the number of fragments. But in your real projects, yeah, it's kind of up to you how you arrange that. Any other questions? All right, so thank you very much, and apologies for some of the tech not working today.